He remembered the moment he first realized that the realm was ripe for the taking. Petyr Baelish, Littlefinger to most, had spent a lifetime wearing misdirection as comfortably as other men wore cloaks. On the surface, he was merely a minor lord from the Fingers, a sly, grinning man elevated beyond his station by cunning and opportunism. And yet, no matter how low the great lords of Westeros tried to place him in their reckoning, he always found a way to climb. He had done it with gold, with whispered schemes, and with the illusions he wove around all those who relied so dearly on his talents. For every new power in the land, he found a thread to pull, a scheme to orchestrate, a rumor to spread. He thrived in the shadows, but the time for shadows alone had passed. When he looked at Sansa Stark, young, innocent in certain ways but far from ignorant, he saw a means to realize his deepest ambitions. Her name was known in every corner of the Seven Kingdoms, for the Starks were a house beloved by commoners and nobles alike. She was, in fact, the rightful heir to the North after the horrors that had fallen her family. A sympathetic figure, a wounded bird who had survived King's Landing, lost her parents to the war, and now stood poised to claim a measure of justice in a land hungry for new leadership. Petyr Baelish recognized she was also a woman of increasingly steely resolve. He had witnessed her transformation from a naive girl into a determined, if at times shaken, would-be survivor. He had stoked that fire carefully, offering her small lessons about the games men played, about the nature of power. And from these ashes of tragedy and heartbreak, a new Sansa had begun to emerge. In the Vale, he whispered a plan to her, the details delicate and labyrinthine but clear enough at their core. The Iron Throne was vulnerable, and if one possessed the knowledge of how to manipulate loyalties, how to feed men the illusions they wanted, how to cast illusions of their own, then a new alliance could be made and crowned. So they set themselves upon that path. Littlefinger told Sansa that their first step would be winning the Vale. From those mountains and from the Child Lord, Robert Arryn, Baelish had drawn near absolute control. With the Knights of the Vale at their backs, and the strategic location of the Eyrie as a bastion of power, they had a foundation upon which to build. Sansa, uncertain of her own abilities, leaned upon Petyr's expertise. She soon learned that while lies and secrets held no appeal for her sense of honor, the realm itself would not survive if it continued to be controlled by the warring factions that had already torn it apart. The Lannisters were despised for their treachery and greed. The Tyrells held power in the Reach, but their hold on King's Landing was precarious, reliant on Marjorie's position as queen. The Starks of the North had been decimated by war and betrayal. The Boltons, curse them, still occupied Winterfell, or so rumor said. And in the east, the Targaryen queen, Daenerys, lurked with dragons and an army of freedmen, waiting for her chance to cross the narrow sea. Yet, ironically, it was this chaos that invited the cunning to prosper. Petyr urged Sansa to think of herself not just as a survivor, but as the key to bridging the North and the Vale, and perhaps one day more. For a time, no one in the wider realm suspected. They took no notice of the red-haired girl, still cloistered high in the Eyrie, tutoring her sickly cousin, playing the part of a modest ward. They scarcely paid any mind to Petyr Baelish's new expansions of influence in the Riverlands and his continued hold on the Vale's finances. But beneath that quiet facade, Sansa was learning. Over weeks and months, she read books about the histories of grand alliances and the tragedies that came of misguided loyalties. She listened to the older lords and ladies gossip and gleaned valuable insights about their prejudices, ambitions, and fears. Littlefinger's web of informants brought news from King's Landing, from the Stormlands, from as far as the Free Cities, telling him which lords were unhappy, which houses clung to old grudges, which knights might be bribed to switch allegiances. Bit by bit, they built a plan as patient as it was audacious. The moment for their first move arrived shortly after word reached the Eyrie that Tommen Baratheon, still a boy, though crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms, had begun to rule more decisively under the guidance of Cersei Lannister. The Lannisters, battered though they were by the war, were not prepared to yield the throne to any. And while Marjorie Tyrell still served as queen, relations between the Queen Regent and the Tyrell family had grown ever more strained, as each vied for the power that came with holding the capital. Littlefinger watched those tensions and smiled a thin, calculating smile. Cersei's suspicion of the Tyrells might be used to pry the capital apart at its seams if carefully managed, and he was eager to be the hand that plucked that thread. But first, they needed a show of force that would let the realm know the Vale stood strong and no longer hidden. Petyr Baelish convinced Lord Yohn Royce to lead a contingent of the Vale's knights out to quell a band of outlaws terrorizing the Riverlands. That band was rumored to have been partially funded, secretly, by Baelish himself. When the Knights of the Vale rode forth and swept these marauders from the roads, it earned them gratitude and admiration from common folk who had grown accustomed to seeing Lannister men demanding harsh tolls or incompetent soldiers failing to protect the innocent. This newly polished image of the Vale as defenders of justice was carefully cultivated by Baelish's envoys and whispers. In taverns and septs, in markets and minor lordly halls, people began to speak of the Vale with a fresh measure of respect. Meanwhile, Sansa's presence as a Stark was reintroduced to the Riverlands under the cloak of rumor. Whispers spoke of the lost wolf girl, now sheltered in the Eyrie, returned from captivity in King's Landing. That knowledge sparked a yearning in the hearts of men and women who remembered how the Tullis had once ruled the Riverlands with fairness. They remembered Eddard Stark's justice and lamented the tragedies that had befallen his children. Even if the girl was not born in the Riverlands, she carried the legacy of Catelyn Tully, and that was enough to stir loyalty. Some small folk said quietly that perhaps a Stark could bring the North and Riverlands together again, an alliance that might even help ease the burdens of the realm. Others muttered that the Starks were gone for good, but soon, as rumors spread, hope flickered. Sansa herself, though she often felt uncertain, found a newfound source of resolve each time she recalled her father's face. She had once yearned only for songs and gallant knights, but life had taught her harsh lessons. It was Petyr who guided her, offering counsel that both thrilled and unsettled her. Yet, as time went on, she found that she was developing her own instincts. In private conversations with minor lords and ladies of the Vale, Sansa learned how to charm without outright lies, how to guide them into believing that supporting her and Petyr's cause was an act of nobility and virtue. She shifted her posture from that of a frightened girl to a poised young woman of the North. And with each success, with each vow of support for House Stark's rightful place, she gained confidence that perhaps, indeed, she might one day reshape the realm into a kinder place. Their next major move involved forging an accord with certain disaffected lords in the Riverlands, men whose lands had been ravaged by the War of the Five Kings and who had little love for the Lannisters. Though House Frey still held the twins and the memory of the Red Wedding stained the region, there were other houses that did not forget the Tullis. Some had sheltered small pockets of resistance, others had lost entire villages to raiders or brutal reprisals from House Frey's men. Petyr instructed Sansa in the careful game of negotiation, which houses should be approached with promises of restoration, which knights might respond to gold, which would be more convinced by appeals to their honor. Meanwhile, he sent his own envoys ahead to sow rumors that the Vale was prepared to defend its neighbors. At first, these river lords were wary. They remembered how Petyr Baelish served the Lannisters as Master of Coin, how he had married Lisa Tully, and how he had become Lord Protector of the Vale. They questioned his motives. But Sansa Stark was a different prospect. They knew she was Ned Stark's daughter, for that detail was not in question. And Baelish was cunning enough to present himself as merely the caretaker of a cause greater than himself. If House Arryn and House Stark were united, if the Vale and the North could be rallied, then perhaps the Riverlands could find protection. The notion was sweet to the many petty lords who had grown tired of the Freys and Lannisters. Of course, the North itself was another matter entirely. The Boltons held Winterfell, a dreadful mockery of everything the Starks had once stood for. Roose Bolton was rumored to be as cold and calculating as Petyr himself, if more brutal, while his bastard, Ramsay, was spoken of in fearful whispers throughout the North. Those loyal to the Starks looked upon the Bolton rule as a betrayal. Even so, the Northern Lords had made a fragile peace under the Iron Throne's recognition of Roose as Warden of the North. The Lannisters in King's Landing had wanted stability after the War of the Five Kings, and granting Roose Bolton official status seemed the simplest route. But those in the North who still prayed to the old gods in the Godswood, who still remembered Ned Stark's unwavering sense of justice, chafed under this arrangement. For Sansa, the thought of confronting the Boltons tightened her chest with terror and anger. She had never forgiven Roose for what he had done to her mother and brother at the Red Wedding, nor could she forget the monstrous stories of Ramsay's cruelty. Yet, if she and Peter were to claim any rightful position, they would have to deal with Winterfell eventually. If the war in the north erupted once again, they would need more than just the Vale's knights and some riverlords to seize victory. But Peter assured her there were ways to unravel the Bolton hold without a full-scale confrontation. The Boltons had made too many enemies, and their allies only remained so out of fear. If an alternative rose, an alternative with a clear northern claim and the backing of some southern banners, perhaps the Bolton hold would break apart from within. So they laid the groundwork for that as well. Baelish's agents quietly ventured into White Harbor to meet with Lord Wyman Manderly's men. Men who had not forgotten their loyalty to the Starks. Gold changed hands. Promises were whispered that if Manderly supported a Stark restoration, he would be rewarded with certain trade rights and shipments of grain from the Vale, ensuring White Harbor's prosperity. Other lords received messages carefully, couched in the language of old alliances and northern pride. The message was always the same. Sansa Stark was alive and well, under the protection of the Vale, and one day she might come to reclaim what was hers. They asked only for these lords to remember their oaths to House Stark when the moment arrived. That moment came sooner than many suspected. Though chaos spread as rumors thickened, the Lannisters in King's Landing found themselves distracted by the resurrection of old conflicts in Dorne, by the Queen Dowager Cersei's paranoia regarding the Tyrells, and by the meddlesome presence of the Faith militant, who had turned their righteous gaze on the sinful court. This left the North more vulnerable to infiltration, to small acts of subversion. Baelish orchestrated a plan to lure Ramsay Bolton away from Winterfell, using false rumors of potential defectors in the Rills, and to ensure that when he went, his father's men would be tied up dealing with a crisis near the Dreadfort. Meanwhile, a troop of Vale knights, led by Lord Royce himself, would slip into the outskirts of Winterfell, unopposed. They were joined by a handful of men from White Harbor, whose loyalty to the Starks had never truly wavered. All of this hinged on Sansa, still uncertain but emboldened by the chance to liberate her home. She would not be in the main vanguard, but she traveled secretly with Peter and a small escort to a discreet holdfast near Winterfell, waiting for the opportune moment. The plan called for subtlety, subterfuge, and a willingness to exploit the cracks in Bolton rule. Peter Baelish's spies had discovered an undercurrent of resentment among the Bolton guards, especially those who had been pressed into service from minor clans that once rallied behind the Starks. They resented Roose's leadership and feared Ramsay's sadism. Some were susceptible to bribes, some to threats, and some to the flicker of hope that the Starks might return. In the dead of night, several Bolton guards were convinced to open the postern gate, allowing the Vale Knights access to the castle's courtyard. Word spread quietly through the corridors that the rightful Lady of Winterfell had returned. Some men hesitated, frightened of reprisals if they turned cloak, but more than a few decided that serving Sansa Stark was safer than the risk of continuing under the Bolton banner. The capture of Winterfell was swift, blood was spilled, but far less than might have been expected in a protracted siege. Many Bolton loyalists surrendered after the first wave. Roose Bolton, who had remained in the castle, was cornered in the Great Hall with a handful of his most devoted men. Unwilling to yield, he fought defiantly, but the end came when Lord Royce's knights overwhelmed his personal guard. In the final scuffle, Roose was cut down, his face impassive as though he had already accepted his end. When Sansa was finally ushered inside to see the aftermath, the courtyard was lit by torches and reeked of blood. Her home, which she had once left as an innocent girl with dreams of marrying a king, was now strewn with the bodies of men who had served the monsters responsible for her family's downfall. She felt a wave of sorrow, along with a flickering sense of determination. Peter stood at her side, offering a solemn nod. Winterfell was hers again, or more accurately, it belonged to House Stark, which meant it belonged to her. Within hours, lords of the North who had secretly waited for this day rode or sent ravens to declare their renewed allegiance to the Stark name. Ramsay, deprived of his father's cunning and the fortress of Winterfell, found himself stranded when the rumors of betrayal in the Rills turned out to be just that, rumors. He tried to rally what men he could, but many deserted him as soon as they realized that Winterfell had fallen. He was last spotted fleeing into the countryside with a handful of loyal cutthroats. A few days later, news arrived that Ramsay had been cornered by a group of outraged hill folk, men and women who claimed to have been brutalized by him for sport. Their vengeance was swift and savage. That was the end of House Bolton, though Sansa took little solace in the viciousness of her adversary's demise. She only knew she was free of their shadow at last. Now Sansa Stark stood as the Lady of Winterfell, with the Knights of the Vale occupying the courtyard and controlling the gates. She summoned the Lords of the North to a council, inviting them to reaffirm their loyalty or walk away. One by one they pledged their swords. Some did so grudgingly, but many with genuine relief. Petyr Baelish remained in the background, offering quiet counsel. Still, the watchers in the hall took note of how Sansa stood in the seat of her father, calm and poised, while Baelish never tried to overshadow her. Some whispered that the two of them were allied too closely, that the cunning lord might have undue influence over the new Lady of Winterfell. Others saw only a strong union that might keep the North safe, for House Arryn and House Stark allied could indeed be formidable. Once the North was secured, Petyr turned his eye back south. He suggested that Sansa announce her formal authority over the North and her intent to bring justice to all those who had conspired against the Starks. Doing so would place her in direct opposition to the Lannister crown that had legitimized the Boltons. Conflict seemed unavoidable, but Baelish wanted to move carefully. A direct confrontation with the Iron Throne, especially if it summoned the power of the Crownlands and the Reach, could be ruinous for them. Instead, he plotted to undermine the Lannisters from within. He had many old connections in King's Landing, men who still owed him favors, debts, or their silence. He also knew precisely which levers to push to heighten the tension between Cersei and Margaery, between the Crown and the Faith, and between the great houses of the realm. In secret, Lord Baelish traveled south, leaving Sansa in Winterfell to continue building alliances. He made a show of riding to King's Landing under the banner of peace, bringing with him a retinue that included several Knights of the Vale, but no outright northern men. He claimed that he was there simply to settle certain financial affairs and to reassure the crown that the Vale remained loyal. To Cersei's ear, it sounded like a plausible excuse, especially from someone who had once served as Master of Coin. She suspected Littlefinger, but she also needed him, for in the months following Tywin Lannister's death, the realm's finances had become increasingly precarious, and the Iron Bank of Bravos loomed as a threat should the crown continue to default on its debts. Baelish offered solutions, he always did. While in the capital, Petyr set about whispering carefully in the shadows, meeting with those disaffected by the crown or unsettled by the faith militants' growing power. He fed the High Sparrow sly tidbits about the Queen Regent's supposed indulgences and moral lapses, further inflaming the religious leader's determination to bring the mightiest to kneel before the gods. To the Tyrell informants, he slipped rumors that Cersei was plotting to imprison Margaery on charges of treason. To certain Lannister cousins who were uneasy about how Cersei was managing the realm, he hinted that the Queen Regent's next moves could cause a new civil war. Quietly, these seeds of chaos grew. At the same time, through discreet couriers, Baelish maintained contact with Sansa, informing her which alliances were ripening. He recommended she send emissaries to House Manderly, House Glover, and others to ensure they were well-provisioned and ready to march if called upon. Meanwhile, Sansa continued to rule in Winterfell with the guidance of certain elder lords who had been loyal to Ned. She presided over mending roads, distributing food, and punishing those few remaining Bolton collaborators who had terrorized the small folk. Reports circulated that she was showing kindness, that the fields around Winterfell were finally seeing some stability, that even the children had begun to hope for a reprieve from war. This bolstered Sansa's reputation as a Stark who cared for her people. Soon, the realm began to hear the faint rumor that Sansa Stark might be something more. Baelish let these rumors stir quietly, that she might not only reclaim the North, but also claim the Tully heritage in the Riverlands, forging a grand alliance between the Vale, the North, and her mother's homeland. Gradually, that rumor turned into another, that perhaps she had as strong a claim to the Iron Throne as Tommen Baratheon, whose parentage was widely doubted. The official line from King's Landing was that Tommen was Robert Baratheon's son, but many in the realm knew better. They remembered the truth that had sparked the War of the Five Kings in the first place, that Joffrey, Myrcella, and Tommen were born of Cersei and Jaime's incest, and that none had a legitimate claim to the Baratheon name. Of course, Sansa's claim was tenuous from a strictly legal standpoint, but if she could win the support of key lords, if she could be framed as the rightful lady of the North and heir to Tully's Riverlands, and if the realm grew tired enough of Lannister tyranny, then law and tradition might bend to popular demand. Sansa, hearing these whispers for the first time, was uncertain. She had long dreamt of being a queen when she was a little girl, but that dream had curdled in King's Landing's intrigues. However, she recognized the possibility that if she held the Iron Throne, she could ensure peace in a realm battered by years of war. And more than that, she could see justice visited upon those who had destroyed her family. Still, she felt torn, wondering if the ambition was hers or only Peter's. But Baelish had a way of persuading her that it was a necessary step for the good of the realm, that only by seizing power at the highest level could they halt the endless bloodshed. He spoke to her in quiet halls, telling her that the Lannisters would never leave the North in peace if they retained the Iron Throne, that the Tyrells might one day look to supplant them all, that Daenerys Targaryen's rumored dragons could bring fire and blood to all 7 kingdoms unless someone else consolidated control first. Eventually, she agreed that they should continue to explore the possibility. If the lords of Westeros saw a future in a Stark-led monarchy, if they despised the Lannisters enough, then perhaps they could unify the realm under her rule. The next steps required cunning beyond measure. Baelish returned to the Vale, rallying the Lords Declarant who had once questioned his rule. He swayed them with a combination of flattery, promises of influence in the new order, and cold threats that their houses would suffer if they did not comply. Most, from Lord Nestor Royce to the other minor lords, grudgingly agreed, partially because they saw that Peter Baelish had the ear of Lady Sansa Stark. The Knights of the Vale now served as a powerful military asset, loyal not just to Baelish but increasingly to the idea of a reunited realm under House Stark and Arryn by extension. In the Riverlands, lords who still loathed the phrase and the Lannisters began to gather under the banner of the Tully Fish, stirred by the notion that Catelyn Tully's daughter would restore their lands to prosperity. The final straw came when the phrase, grown arrogant, miscalculated by seizing additional lands near Seaguard. That action outraged nearby lords who had tenuous truces with the phrase, and a small rebellion sparked. Baelish's whispers fanned that spark into a conflagration, making certain that Frey outrages were widely known. Soon enough, the call to arms rang out, and many river lords rebelled. House Frey, despised for the Red Wedding, found few allies rushing to their defense, for even the Lannisters were too consumed by their capital's unrest to provide immediate aid. It was at that crucial juncture that Sansa, advised by Peter, made her move. She led a host from the north, marching south alongside Knights of the Vale. They joined forces with the rebel river lords. As Sansa approached the twins, she summoned Walder Frey to account for his actions. The old man, furious and frightened, refused to yield. But old Walder's pride had always outstripped his wisdom, and with a united army of the North and the Vale standing against the Freys, his cause looked grim. A siege began, cutting off food supplies to the twins, while subterfuge rotted the house from within. Some of Walder's own sons, resentful of their father's favoritism, conspired to betray him if it meant saving themselves. When the twins fell, the banners of House Frey were stripped from the battlements. Walder Frey was brought before the assembled lords of the Riverlands for justice. Memories of the Red Wedding still burned like an open wound, and the old man stood defiant. But the lords cried for his blood, and though Sansa's heart pounded with memories of her mother and brother, she determined that Walder Frey deserved an execution. In a move echoing the old ways of the North, she declared that as Lady of Winterfell and daughter of the murdered Catelyn Tully, she herself would pass the sentence. She raised a sword, one of the Valyrian steel blades reclaimed from the Boltons, and ended Walder Frey's life with a single stroke. The moment carried a solemn hush across the crowd. No songs were sung, no cheers erupted. Many felt a profound sense of relief, but also a sense that a dark chapter in the realm's history had finally closed. With the twins taken, the Riverlords flocked to Sansa's cause. They saw her as an avenging figure, forging a path of reconciliation and justice. It helped that Petyr Baelish managed the rewards and punishments carefully, ensuring that each lord who joined them received some portion of land or authority, and that those who remained neutral understood the cost of doing so. Through these maneuvers, House Stark had effectively gained the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands. Only the Westerlands, Crownlands, Reach, Stormlands, and Dorne lay outside their growing coalition. Yet the Westerlands were weakened by years of war, and the Crownlands had grown restless under the Faith's meddling. The Reach was powerful, but beset by internal conflicts sparked by Cersei's hostility toward Margaery and the Tyrells. The Stormlands were practically leaderless since Stannis Baratheon's demise, and a Targaryen threat loomed overseas, though uncertain in its timing. Still, Sansa and Petyr knew that to claim the Iron Throne, they would need a decisive strike. They aimed their gaze at King's Landing. The capital had festered under the toxic rivalry of Cersei Lannister and Margaery Tyrell. Tommen, still but a child in many ways, was overshadowed by the manipulations of his mother and the High Sparrow. Popular unrest simmered. The Tyrells, for their part, were alarmed by the growing threat of Sansa Stark, but they also despised the Lannisters. A cunning notion formed in Petyr Baelish's mind, that the Tyrells could be leveraged to betray the Lannisters entirely if they were offered a promise of continued power in the Reach, plus a royal marriage of some sort. Of course, that hinged on whom Sansa would be willing to marry, or if she might be willing to arrange a marriage that benefited the Tyrells. A flurry of diplomatic overtures ensued. Petyr arranged secret meetings with Margaery's grandmother, Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, whose hatred for the Lannisters was legendary. Though Olenna was wary of Baelish's duplicity, she recognized the advantage in aligning with House Stark. Her family's tenuous hold on King's Landing had become more trouble than it was worth. Sansa wrote letters as well, urging peace and a new era of cooperation, but leaving open the possibility of forging a marriage alliance or granting the Tyrells a prominent position in her nascent court. The Tyrells demanded security, certain revenue streams, and the official recognition of their rights in the Reach. Baelish readily agreed on Sansa's behalf, though Sansa insisted that any official union must preserve the North's autonomy and her own authority as queen-to-be. In the capital, tensions reached a boiling point when the High Sparrow finally had Queen Margaery arrested on charges of false piety and other manufactured sins. Cersei tried to seize that opportunity to weaken the Tyrells, but it backfired when the Tyrell forces threatened to storm King's Landing to free Margaery. Crowds rioted, food grew scarce, and the gold cloaks were torn between conflicting loyalties. Meanwhile, Sansa's armies moved south, carefully, quietly occupying Harrenhal, an accursed castle in the Riverlands but a vital strategic point. From there, they could threaten King's Landing from the northwest. The Tyrells, who had mobilized in the Reach, began to march with an uneasy alliance with House Stark's banners. Cersei found herself suddenly surrounded by enemies. The North, Vale, and Riverlands were under Sansa's command. The Tyrells, resentful of the crown, stood poised to invade from the south. Dorne seethed with resentment for the Lannisters' role in Oberyn Martell's death, though they had yet to declare openly for any side. The Lannister forces in the Westerlands had grown thin, bled by earlier conflicts and mercenary wages they could barely afford. And through it all, the Faith militant refused to show any mercy to those it deemed sinners. King Tommen was powerless, drifting between the demands of his mother and the High Sparrow, both of whom tried to claim the boy's allegiance for their own ends. Sansa, encamped at Harrenhal, received envoys from King's Landing. Some were from minor nobles begging for peace, others from desperate merchants seeking safe passage for their goods, and still others from Cersei or Margaery's supporters with contradictory offers. Baelish delighted in this swirl of chaos, for in confusion lay opportunity. He crafted a message to the people of King's Landing, proclaiming that Sansa Stark, descendant of the revered Eddard Stark, had united large swaths of the realm and sought only to bring justice and peace. He reminded them of the Lannisters' corruption, of the wanton cruelty inflicted upon the small folk, and of the monstrous Red Wedding. He played up Sansa's new reputation as a fair ruler, a worthy claimant who would not abide tyranny. The message, distributed by certain well-placed agents, stoked the capital's unrest. Some hailed Sansa as a liberator, while others feared that an invasion would bring more death. At last, the Tyrell host converged with Sansa's forces outside the city walls. King's Landing had never appeared more vulnerable. The Lannisters held the Red Keep, but thousands of peasants roamed the streets, half-starved or whipped into fervor by the faith militant. The time for final negotiations arrived. Margaery Tyrell managed to slip word to Sansa that she would happily withdraw any Tyrell claim to the throne if Sansa guaranteed that the Tyrells kept their lands and privileges in the Reach, and if Margaery were freed from the faith's grasp. Sansa agreed. She only required that Margaery, now clearly done with Tommen, publicly declare her support for Sansa's ascension as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. All that remained was dislodging the Lannisters from their seat of power, a seat that had become more symbol than substance. Cersei, cornered and enraged, threatened to burn the city with wildfire, a rumor that spread quickly among the small folk, driving terror into their hearts. Petyr Baelish, anticipating such madness, had already planted men within the ranks of the Alchemists' Guild, ensuring that if Cersei tried anything rash, the sabotage would be swift. On the appointed day, Sansa's banners flew outside the city gates, while the Tyrell forces pressed from the south. Parley was called. Cersei Lannister herself, accompanied by a small retinue of gold-cloaked guards, marched out to meet Sansa. Tommen was not with her. Rumor had it the Boy King had been locked in the Red Keep for his own safety. In the field of confrontation, surrounded by the hush of thousands of armed men, Cersei demanded to know under what authority the Stark girl thought she could depose a crowned king. She raged about the legality of Tommen's rule, about the betrayal of the Tyrells, and about the so-called slander of her family's name. But Sansa, now no longer the timid girl who once quailed at the Queen's sneers, met Cersei's accusations with measured resolve. She reminded Cersei that Joffrey's cruelty had led to his downfall, that Tommen's claim was tainted, and that House Lannister had spilt Stark blood with impunity, forcing the North into rebellion. She spoke with a calm authority born of the tragedies she had witnessed, and the men who stood behind her, from the Vale, the Riverlands, the North, and the Reach, symbolized the realm's exasperation with Lannister rule. Cersei threatened and cajoled, but Petyr Baelish made it clear that the city could not withstand a siege from multiple sides, not with the small folk already turning restless. The Queen Regent knew, in that moment, that her old ally had become her greatest betrayer. Outnumbered, outmaneuvered, Cersei turned abruptly, marching back to the city gates in a swirl of anger. Over the next 2 days, negotiations ensued in a tense standoff. Eventually, it became apparent that the Gold Cloaks would not fight to the death for the Queen Regent. Many of them remembered Ned Stark's downfall, recognized Baelish, and also recognized that the fortunes had shifted. One by one, the city's defenders made it clear they would open the gates if an accord could be struck ensuring their safety. Baelish, with Sansa's approval, offered amnesty to the Gold Cloaks and all city officials if they simply stood down. Word reached Margaery in her captivity, who then leveraged the anger of the small folk against the faith. The faith militant found themselves encircled by a populace that was fed up with famine and fear. The High Sparrow tried to rally the faithful, but without the Tyrells' financial and military support, and with many poor folks seeing Sansa as a new hope, the High Sparrow's hold cracked. Margaery was freed from her cell by a group of Tyrell soldiers who had bribed the jailers. With that, the faith's power in the capital collapsed in a torrent of confusion. Some devout men tried to fight, but the crowd turned on them viciously. Others surrendered and sought mercy from the new power on the field. On the morning the gates opened, Sansa Stark, flanked by the banners of the Wolf's Head, the Falcon of House Arryn, and the Golden Rose of House Tyrell, rode through the city's streets. The sight was extraordinary. Citizens lined the thoroughfare, uncertain of whether to hail their new ruler or fear her. But word had spread that she was the daughter of Ned Stark, a man beloved for his sense of honor. She offered bread and coin to the hungry. She promised that the innocent would not be harmed. She wore clothes of deep gray and white fur, reminiscent of the north, and her red hair shimmered like fire in the wan light. That day, more than a few voices cried out in joy. Many had known only tyranny for so long, they were desperate for any sign of compassion. Meanwhile, in the Red Keep, Cersei Lannister barricaded herself with her loyal guards, nursing the final spark of defiance. Petyr Baelish led a small contingent to the throne room, where he found the guards who remained. Their captain recognized the futility of resisting. At last, the great doors opened, and in walked Sansa Stark to stand before the Iron Throne. Her heart pounded in her ears. She remembered the first time she had come to King's Landing, a starry-eyed girl believing in chivalry. Now she had returned as a conqueror, albeit one who had not spilled a fraction of the blood that others had. Cersei emerged, enraged and grief-stricken, leveling curses at Sansa, at Baelish, at Margaery, at the entire realm. She demanded to see Tommen. Sansa promised that Tommen would be treated gently, that the boy was an innocent in this Game of Thrones. But Cersei refused to relinquish her power. "You have no right," the Queen Regent hissed, her voice trembling with hatred. "You are nothing but a little bird my father let live out of pity." Sansa stared at her for a long moment, remembering all the insults, all the humiliations she had suffered, all the heartbreak. Then she asked if Cersei would surrender so they might spare the city more suffering. Cersei spat on the floor, condemning them all. Baelish quietly signaled the guards, and Cersei was seized, struggling and shrieking. Many in the throne room looked on in silent shock at the spectacle. Tommen was found in his chambers, frightened and alone, having realized that his mother had all but lost. Sansa met the boy king and promised he would be cared for, but he would no longer sit the Iron Throne. At that, Tommen only nodded, tears running down his cheeks. He was too young to fully grasp his downfall or to fight it. When Sansa announced that he would live in the Red Keep under guard until a final decision was made about his future, the people seemed relieved. At last, Sansa ascended the steps to the Iron Throne itself. She did not sit immediately. She looked at the monstrous seat of swords, forged by Aegon the Conqueror. She thought of how many had died for this symbol, how many had been betrayed. She felt the weight of the entire realm pressing upon her shoulders. Petyr Baelish stood at her side, his face a mask of triumph, yet also tinged with something deeper: ambition, satisfaction, and perhaps a flicker of what he might call love. Margaery Tyrell, now freed from the Faith cells, appeared in the throne room with her grandmother, Olenna, both wearing satisfied expressions that concealed their own agendas. The Lords of the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North were present, along with Tyrell bannermen. Then Sansa Stark, Lady of Winterfell and the Eyrie, slowly lowered herself onto the Iron Throne. The old steel pressed against her back. She was not crowned yet, not officially, but in that moment, many in attendance fell to their knees. Some did so out of opportunism, some out of genuine relief, and others simply to follow the tide of history. Petyr Baelish knelt as well, though he kept his eyes fixed on Sansa. She could feel the chair's sharp edges biting through her cloak. It was a reminder that power in Westeros was never gentle, never free of danger. She had come to this place, ironically, through the man who had once betrayed her father, and through the alliances forged by the blood of her family. It was a moment both victorious and tragic. The coronation followed in the days thereafter. With Tommen formally deposed, and news spreading across the realm, it was time to legitimize Sansa's claim. Lords from many regions traveled to King's Landing to witness this new queen. Some did so skeptically, others with relief, for they believed that any monarch from the line of Stark would be more just than another Lannister or a Targaryen returning from exile. The High Septon, newly appointed after the Faith militants' downfall, presided over the coronation ceremony. Sansa wore a gown of pale gray that reflected her northern roots, and her hair was pinned back in a modest style, a far cry from the extravagant southern fashions she once adored. She knelt before the altar of the Seven, though quietly she prayed to her father's old gods, remembering the weirwood trees of Winterfell. The High Septon placed a simple crown upon her head, one wrought of silver and weirwood motifs. The act was solemn, greeted by cheers from a crowd hungry for a new beginning. Sansa rose as Sansa of House Stark, first of her name, Queen of the Undulls, the Roiner, and the First Men, Protector of the Realm. The hall erupted in celebration, though a current of uncertainty lingered beneath the surface. She had claimed power in a realm still fractured, still scarred by war. At her side stood Petyr Baelish, named Lord Paramount of the Trident, the Vale, and Master of Laws. Some said Master of Whispers in all but name. Across the hall, Margaery Tyrell offered a graceful bow, her alliance secured with the new queen. Many lords murmured that this was an unprecedented shift in the balance of power, with the North, once considered too remote to rule, now holding the reins of the Iron Throne. In the weeks and months that followed, Sansa worked tirelessly to restore order. Much of the labor fell to Petyr Baelish, who orchestrated new council positions, ensuring that certain old houses felt included. He made sure the Tyrells controlled enough seats to remain placated. He sent emissaries to Dorne, offering them a role in the new regime, as well as the opportunity to avenge past grievances if they wished. The Lannisters in the Westerlands were forced to swallow the bitter reality of their loss, though some holdouts remained. Cersei languished in a prison cell, overshadowed by her own misdeeds, awaiting a trial that might well end in her execution. A formal treaty was declared, binding the Vale, the Riverlands, and the North into one confederacy under Sansa's direct sovereignty. The Reach allied through the Tyrells, securing their privileges. Slowly, tribute and taxes began to flow into the capital's coffers. Baelish maneuvered to repay a fraction of the Iron Bank's loans, staving off immediate financial crisis. Sansa assembled a council that included a few wise lords from the North, the Vale, and even King's Landing, striving to blend different perspectives. She ordered that the crown must sponsor the rebuilding of war-torn areas, that roads and harvests should be repaired, and that the small folk were to be protected. She vowed to personally oversee the reestablishment of the rule of law, so that men like Walder Frey and Roose Bolton could never again commit atrocities with impunity. But shadows lingered. Daenerys Targaryen still loomed across the sea with her dragons. The wild north beyond the wall remained unsettled, and winter's chill was creeping slowly across the land. Some said that the Night's Watch required help, that the threat of the others was more than just a fairy tale. Sansa herself was not entirely sure what to believe of the rumors, but she had heard her brother Jon speak of such things long ago, before so much changed. She dispatched a raven to the wall, hoping to learn the truth of what might dwell beyond. Meanwhile, Petyr Baelish solidified his position as a power behind the throne. He expertly crushed any dissent among the lords by awarding them small boons or by hinting at the alternative, ruin. He maintained a secret network of spies that reached every corner of the realm. In dark corners, some murmured that Sansa Stark was but a figurehead, and that Baelish truly ruled. Others insisted that the new queen would never allow herself to be controlled by the man who had betrayed her father, that she was learning his ways but would never become his puppet. Indeed, Sansa proved more astute than many expected. She questioned Baelish openly during council sessions, forced him to explain his financial projections, and occasionally vetoed his bolder ideas. She recognized that while his cunning was invaluable, letting him run rampant could lead the realm back into ruin. Yet, tensions between them remained beneath the surface. Petyr believed he deserved Sansa's complete trust, even something more personal but Sansa's memories of his history, how he had conspired in the death of her Aunt Lysa, how he had once betrayed Ned, kept her vigilant. Their dynamic was a dance of caution and necessity, each needing the other's strengths, each wary of giving too much away. For now, they maintained a workable alliance. At court, Baelish was often praised as the realm's new savior, the cunning architect of peace, while Sansa was hailed as the gentle wolf queen who would heal the land's wounds. Despite their relative success in forging this new monarchy, the realm still simmered with trouble. Some Lannister loyalists in the Westerlands refused to recognize Sansa's rule, holding out in their ancestral seat of Casterly Rock. Jaime Lannister, newly returned from a failed campaign in the Riverlands, turned his anger toward the new queen, though his will to fight had been eroded by so many years of bloodshed. The Greyjoys still reaved the coasts, ignoring the authority of any who might call themselves king or queen on the mainland. Meanwhile, the Targaryen loyalists across the narrow sea whispered that Daenerys was the true heir, the mother of dragons, who would come to reclaim the land her ancestors once conquered. Sansa held court in the Red Keep's throne room, where supplicants petitioned her for justice each day. She wore a circlet crown reminiscent of the North's aesthetic, not the gaudy monstrosity favored by past kings. She insisted on hearing the common folk's complaints, though that was exhausting work. Lady Brienne of Tarth was named Lord Commander of the Queensguard, having arrived to pledge her sword in memory of her vow to Catelyn Stark. Brienne's presence helped reassure many that Sansa intended to uphold the ideals of honor, loyalty, and compassion. Each night, Sansa would retire to her private chambers, overwhelmed by the weight of rulership. She would reflect on the hardships that led her here and wonder how she might guide the realm through winter and beyond. Amid these challenges, certain victories offered hope. The Riverlands, freed of the Frey yoke, began to see a resurgence of trade along the Trident. The North, with Winterfell restored as a seat of power, stabilized under Sansa's chosen castellan, an old friend of the Starks and the White Harbor Lords. The Vale saw an influx of wealth as trade routes reconnected. The capital, though still burdened by poverty and damage from riots, slowly started to rebuild, guided by new city officials who answered to the Queen's Council. Orphanages and soup kitchens were financed to quell unrest. The Crown's gold cloaks, newly purged of corruption under Baelish's careful direction, patrolled the streets with more discipline. Some said that King's Landing had not known such relative order in years, though it was still far from safe. All the while, the specter of the Targaryens grew larger. Reports came from the narrow sea that Daenerys had crossed with her Unsullied, her Dothraki, and her dragons. A portion of the fleet landed in Dorne, forging an alliance with the discontented Dornish. Another part of the fleet landed near Dragonstone. The rumor mill spun tales of how Daenerys would burn the city if it did not yield, or that she sought to bring freedom to the small folk in every corner of Westeros. Sansa knew she could not ignore the arrival of the Dragon Queen. She quietly reached out through her own emissaries, testing to see if Daenerys might be amenable to a negotiated settlement. After all, they both shared a desire to see the Lannisters dethroned, and that was already accomplished. But the Targaryen claim was ancient, stretching back centuries, and Daenerys might not be content to let the North rule from the Iron Throne. Peter Baelish insisted that Daenerys Targaryen's arrival need not be a threat if it were cleverly managed. He recommended forging a grand marriage alliance. If Daenerys were to wed someone from Sansa's inner circle, someone who could stand as a consort or a powerful ally, then perhaps the Targaryens and Starks might unite. But who would that be? Baelish proposed himself, in a cunning whisper, but Sansa dismissed that out of hand, suspicious of his motives. Another possibility was to wed Daenerys to a High Lord of the North or the Vale, but the Targaryen queen was known for her independent streak, and no one knew if she'd accept. As negotiations began, Daenerys demanded recognition of her claim to the throne, though that was obviously a non-starter for Sansa. The new queen refused to kneel to a Targaryen who had never set foot in Westeros until now. Daenerys, for her part, believed it was her birthright, and so began a new round of complex diplomacy. Some worried it could spark another war, and war was the last thing the realm needed after so many years of death and destruction. Meanwhile, the wind turned colder. A raven arrived from the wall. The Night's Watch, greatly diminished in number, had encountered whites in increasing frequency. Rumors swirled of the White Walkers, that they were on the march. The Lord Commander of the Watch pleaded for aid from the south, warning that if the rumors were true, all the petty squabbles over the throne would pale before the threat of the undead. Sansa, recalling Ned Stark's teachings, gave the letter serious consideration, though many in the south dismissed it as fantasy. Peter Baelish believed it might be a convenient ruse to keep the realm's focus away from the Targaryen invasion, or any other power plays. But Sansa was not certain. She remembered old Nan's stories, half lost in her childhood memories. She hesitated, caught between the immediate concerns of Daenerys' arrival and the intangible dread beyond the wall. Thus, Sansa Stark, now seated upon the Iron Throne, found herself at the nexus of decisions that could shape the future of the Seven Kingdoms. The North looked to her for leadership, the Vale owed her loyalty through Peter's manipulations, the Riverlands revered her as a Tully reborn, and the Reach had allied through the cunning deals with Marjorie Tyrell. Yet, threats remained on all sides. The Lannister loyalists in the Westerlands, the Ironborn Reavers, the Targaryen forces massing with dragons, and the possibility of the others beyond the wall. It was a precarious peace, more fragile than an autumn leaf on the wind. Still, for the first time in a long while, Sansa felt that there might be hope. She had reclaimed her home, avenged her family, and carried the Stark banner into King's Landing. She had taken the throne not through unbridled slaughter, but through alliances and cunning, navigating the labyrinth that was Westerosi politics. Perhaps, in some corner of her heart, she felt pride that she had broken free from the nightmares of her youth. If she could keep the realm together, if she could channel Peter's cunning without becoming trapped by it, if she could make peace with the Dragon Queen or at least find a way to coexist, then maybe she could bring a lasting era of stability to Westeros. At the end of the day, as she sat upon that jagged seat of swords, she wondered if she would be remembered as Sansa the Just or Sansa the Usurper. Would the bards sing of her mercy, or would they curse her name for the machinations and betrayals that had paved her ascent? She was no longer the naive girl yearning for stories of gallant knights and fair maidens. She was a queen now, forged by tragedy and taught by a master of ambition. And so she gathered her council, commanded the realm's forces, and prepared to face whatever winter might bring. Days turned to weeks and weeks to months. King's Landing gradually adjusted to the new monarchy. Some houses openly thrived under the shift in power, while others plotted in secret. Peter Baelish quietly tightened his network of informants, rooting out anyone who might undermine their new order. Sansa found herself presiding over a swirl of ceremonial occasions, from weddings to funerals, each steeped in the pageantry of a realm that had known too many kings in too short a time. She gave audience to foreign envoys from Bravos and Pentos, seeking new trade agreements. She tried to ease the tensions with the faith by allowing them certain freedoms, though she refused to restore the faith militant after its destructive role in the city. Day by day, she juggled the obligations of queenship with the looming worry that the Targaryen queen might soon march or sail on the capital. When at last Daenerys Targaryen made landfall near King's Landing with a fraction of her forces, just enough to test the queen's mettle, Sansa sent a diplomatic party to meet her. She tried to reason with Daenerys, to propose an alliance of equals, to address the threat beyond the wall. Daenerys listened politely, but her fury at having her birthright taken by another remained. Still, she did not attack outright, for the combined forces of the North, Vale, and Reach were formidable. The presence of the Tyrell armies meant that Daenerys could not rely on an easy victory in the south. Instead, a fragile stalemate took shape. Daenerys hovered at Dragonstone, scouring the horizon with her dragons. Sansa ruled from King's Landing, aware that only a misstep could trigger a new war. Amid this tension, the realm received another dire warning from the wall. The long night had come again, or so they claimed. The dead were rising in large numbers, the ancient enemy of mankind stirring beyond the wall. Sansa convened an emergency council with her advisors. Peter Baelish was skeptical, though he recognized the advantage of uniting the realm against a common foe if the threat was even half real. Marjorie Tyrell and her grandmother argued that the living must stand together, that they should forge an alliance with Daenerys to repel whatever was coming from the far north. But how to trust a queen with dragons who believed herself the rightful ruler? Sansa made a decision that would shape the future of Westeros. She extended an invitation to Daenerys Targaryen to come to King's Landing in peace, to witness proof of the undead threat. She promised safe conduct, guaranteed by her word as a Stark. If Daenerys refused, then the blame for any future disaster would rest on her shoulders. If she accepted, then perhaps the realm would see a path to unity. Peter Baelish tried to dissuade Sansa from such a dangerous meeting, fearing a trap that could unseat their hard-won throne. But Sansa, recalling her father's sense of honor, insisted that it was the only way. Enough blood had been shed over claims to the Iron Throne. If they truly faced an existential threat, then the realm needed a different kind of leadership. And so, amidst the hush of winter's first snows drifting onto the capital, Daenerys Targaryen's retinue arrived at the city gates. She rode in at the head of her party, cloaked in black and red, her silver hair a stark contrast to the pale sky. Alongside her walked Grey Worm and a handful of Unsullied, regal in their discipline. Tyrion Lannister accompanied her as Hand of the Queen, wearing a solemn expression. The streets were lined with curious onlookers, many having never seen the Dragon Queens like before. Sansa awaited her in the throne room, the seat of power that had once belonged to Daenerys' ancestors. The meeting was tense, charged with centuries of history. Tyrion's gaze flickered upon seeing Sansa on the Iron Throne, remembering their brief marriage and the trials they had both endured in King's Landing. Daenerys regarded the Targaryen sigil that once hung in the hall, replaced now by the dire wolf of House Stark. Still, Sansa greeted her with cool politeness, acknowledging that Daenerys had a strong claim to the throne by lineage, but that the realm had chosen another path in crowning Sansa. She offered an alliance, conditional upon confirmation of the threat beyond the wall. If the White Walkers were real, then all the living had one enemy that mattered. Daenerys listened carefully. She had come prepared to force Sansa's submission or to see if the new queen's power was as firm as rumors claimed. But the sincerity in Sansa's voice gave her pause. She had not expected the Wolf Queen to bend so quickly in the face of potential war with the dead. Tyrion, noting his former wife's transformation from frightened child to resolute monarch, spoke quietly of the advantage in uniting. If they refused and the undead truly marched, all would perish. Daenerys considered them carefully, thinking of her dragons. She had 3, though one had grown dangerously aggressive. She recognized that if the White Walkers were a real threat, her dragons might be crucial to defeating them. Yet, the matter of the throne could not be ignored. Daenerys demanded to know if Sansa would yield once the threat was defeated. Sansa refused to promise that outright, explaining that the realm had already endured too many conquerors. If Daenerys wished to rule, she had to earn the trust of Westeros, not scorch it with dragonfire. A chilly stalemate ensued, but each woman recognized the logic of cooperating, at least for a time. They agreed to dispatch a joint force north to confirm the undead threat, perhaps even to capture a white as proof for those who still doubted. In this single agreement, the shape of the realm's future was poised upon a razor's edge. Sansa had successfully seized the Iron Throne through cunning alliances and the help of Petyr Baelish, forging a new monarchy that offered a chance at stability. But the arrival of Daenerys Targaryen, the question of the undead, and the lingering pockets of Lannister resistance in the Westerlands meant that no queen's rule was ever guaranteed. Still, for the moment, the realm had found a leader in Sansa Stark, a woman who had been shaped by tragedy into a ruler determined to spare others what she had endured. Late in the night, as the city slept, Sansa stood on a balcony overlooking the Blackwater Bay. The moonlight shimmered on the dark water. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay armies of the dead, or so the watch claimed. Nearby, in hidden coves, Daenerys' ships anchored, bearing dragons that could burn the city to ash. And within the Red Keep, Petyr Baelish no doubt schemed to ensure his place in this new world. Sansa closed her eyes, breathing in the cold wind. She thought of her father, of her mother, of Robb, of Arya and Bran and Rickon, scattered across memory and rumor. All her life, she had sought safety in illusions, once in the pretty songs of knights and maidens, later in the vain hope that King's Landing's courtiers would protect her. Now she was queen of the 7 kingdoms, or as many of them as her banners could hold. And she understood, in her marrow, that the illusions had fallen away at last. She was alone upon a lofty seat of power, supported by alliances that could crumble if not carefully tended, threatened by forces both living and dead. Was it worth it? Had she done the right thing by toppling Tommen and Cersei, by relying on Peter's sly manipulations, by executing Walder Frey in cold blood? The realm might be more stable under her, but stability was not guaranteed, not while winter loomed. Still, as she gazed upon the glittering bay, she recalled the face of the small child who had reached out to her when she visited the city's orphanage the day before, offering a flower as thanks. The child had a mother who remembered Ned Stark's compassion, who told her daughter stories of the honorable man from the north. In that moment, Sansa realized she might be forging a legacy of her own, hopefully one that would overshadow the bloodshed that brought her here. So she bowed her head in silent prayer to her father's gods, to the old gods of the north, to the seven worshipped in the city, and to whatever powers might watch over the fate of mankind. She prayed for the strength to unite the realm against all threats, for the wisdom to guide her people through winter's hardships, and for the courage to face each new betrayal or test of arms. Far behind her, in the distant corridors of the Red Keep, Peter Baelish whispered instructions to spies and envoys, no doubt orchestrating the next moves in the game that never truly ended. But for once, Sansa Stark felt the hush of the night wrap around her like a cloak. She was no longer the little bird trapped in a gilded cage. She was the wolf on the throne, and though the path ahead was treacherous, she had claimed her place in the story of Westeros. Thus did Sansa Stark and Peter Baelish seize the Iron Throne through careful maneuvering. And thus did they face the new dawn of a realm at the brink of winter, uncertain if their fragile unity would hold against dragons, undead, and the countless hungers of men. The throne was won, but ruling in the wake of so many wars was a challenge all its own. In that twilight between peace and the storms that might yet come, Queen Sansa Stark steeled herself for whatever trials lay ahead, determined that the tragedies of the past would not be repeated. And even as she resolved to save her people, she wondered whether the iron price of power would forever stain her hands, or if, in the end, she might prove worthy of the songs that would one day be sung of the Wolf Queen who rose in the darkest hour of the realm.